Welcome to the Apologetics Guy Show. It's the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible, and then helps you to better explain your faith with both courage and compassion. If we're just meeting, I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario. I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm also a professor of Bible and theology at the Moody Bible Institute, and I want to welcome you to my independent show. Well, today our topic on the podcast is how to explain your faith in an emotionally driven culture. And we're thinking about questions like, how can we better speak to the concerns of the people that we meet and present Christianity in a way that's not only true, but also beautiful and good, and present the good news like it actually is good news. I have two guests coming to us via StreamYard today. First guest is Mike Blackaby. Mike is a pastor and church planter in British Columbia, and he also co-wrote this book called Straight to the Heart. And subtitle is Communicating the Gospel in an Emotionally Driven Culture. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and I have a second guest as well, Daniel Blackaby, who also co-authored the book, and he runs a cultural engagement ministry called Collision. Welcome.
Hey, thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, you know, when I was doing my graduate work in Christian apologetics back in the early 2000s, we were mostly trained to answer intellectual kinds of challenges to the faith, because those were actually the kinds of questions that a lot of people in the culture were asking. So a lot of philosophical questions that had to do with the beginning of the universe, had to do with science, had to do with philosophy. But I remember the first time I met someone who actually didn't have any rational objections to Christianity. And they just had this kind of emotional reaction to it. Like, I'm not even really sure what Christianity teaches. I just know it's not for me, or it just kind of rubs me the wrong way for some reason. And I honestly felt kind of ill-equipped to deal with that, because I was like, if you don't have an objection to the Christian faith, I don't really know what to say. And so I think we're seeing a change in the way that people are encountering challenges. It's most often not only these intellectual challenges that are forefront in people's minds, but emotional challenges as well. And so, Daniel, I want to start with you. How have you seen in your ministry, how have you seen the landscape changing in terms of the kinds of questions that many people are asking about our faith?
We're in the same boat as you, that we both did doctoral work at Southern Theological Seminary in the field of apologetics. So, there's a bit of a disconnect. Not a lot of people are necessarily setting me up for the alley-oop to fling out the cosmological argument or, some of these classic apologetic things that I was trained to give. Their objections were coming from the heart. It was more, not question whether God is true, but whether God is good.
Mm-hmm.
The question is just, so how do we respond to that? And not that any of these other arguments that we've learned and trained and, that have benefited us, not that those don't have a place, because those definitely still do. But if the objections are different, then how can we frame our responses to answer those questions and not just the questions we might wish that the culture was asking?
Yeah. How does the concept of live your truth or my truth, how have you seen that in the culture related to this issue of the heart? Let me ask Mike to weigh in on that.
If you're operating at more of a rational level, then there's a lot of kind of shared language and stuff that you can use to talk with somebody about the truth. Like, you're maybe trying to use the same tools to figure out what is true. But if all of a sudden they're coming at it from a sense of what I feel about what is true, then you can come to a roadblock with people if you don't know how to get around that. Where you're talking with somebody and they might say, That's great. You've presented to me all these facts and logic and reason,
Mm-hmm.
and that's great for you. If that's how you've come to see things, then good for you. But that's not how I've come to see things. That can potentially derail the conversation if we don't really know how to move past that.
Yeah. So rather than thinking someone's going to say, well, I object to premise 2 in the Kalam cosmological argument. Hence, your argument is perhaps valid, but unsound and not very cogent in my mind. They might just be like, you know what, maybe there's a God, but Christianity is just not for me, and I wouldn't believe in a God who would allow this or that, right? So we had to do the hard work of seeking to understand people and the issues that they face so that we can have better spiritual conversations and not be talking past each other. Mike, in the introduction, I like how you mentioned one of our Moody alumni, Gary Chapman, who wrote the Five Love Languages.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know it was Moody alumni.
Yeah, that classic book. Talk about how you related that to the issue of what you call dialects in speaking this heart language.
Oftentimes, maybe in the form of the older generation trying to speak truth into the lives of the younger generation, they say, I feel like it's just not landing.
Mm.
Chapman in the love languages says, like, you could be very much loving your wife and trying to express love to her, but if you're not expressing love to her in the way that she best receives it, then it's almost like you're not doing it at all. Like she's not really feeling that, and so it can lead to a lot of frustration. I think we see a lot of frustration. It might be that we're not speaking the language in which our culture understands right now. If our culture is operating using different language, using sort of heart language these days, then do we know how to speak that language? And if not, then we might be very well intentioned and ineffective at the same time. And none of us want to be that, right? And so I think it's important for us to ask ourselves the question of, am I communicating effectively? Not just am I communicating the truth, like that's important, right? But if I'm communicating the truth, but they're not receiving it, or they're not understanding it, or they're, then there's a problem there that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Yeah, I like how you say in the book, the head and the heart, they're not enemies. We need both, right? And God speaks to both our rational, our intellect, and the head, but then also the heart and our emotions. And we're whole people, right? That's because we're holistic, real, organic people. We're not just logic machines, but neither are we, entirely just feeling with no rationality. So we got to be able to switch hit and do both, because sometimes you're going to meet somebody who really does just want to talk about, hey, I'm deconstructing my faith because of these very logical, rational kinds of challenges. Other people are like, yeah, I'm just going to give you those. I don't know anything about those syllogisms, but here's how I feel about it, right?
And I think even too, you can even find that within the same person. There might be some rational things, some doctrine areas that they just can't put their head around, in this area. But then in this area, this objection very much rooted in the heart, very much in emotion, or even their rational objections very much still rooted in influenced by experiences that they had. And so even just the head and the heart in all people, just depending on what their own journey has been, can be called for.
Well, one of my favorite stories in the book of Acts, you mentioned this in the book, Daniel, is Paul going to Athens, and I love how he engages the culture there. So I always like to talk about that as a place for us to start the conversation. Talk about how you brought this to light in the book and how he leads off, and what lessons can we take away from Paul's engagement there?
The big takeaway for me that I think maybe we can skip over, because we want to get to the part where Paul's doing the talking, because that's usually the more exciting part, where Paul is in there and he's telling them what to think and he's engaging with them. But prior to that he's also just doing a lot of listening. He's doing a lot of looking, and he's making references to things that, like, I always just picture him as sort of walking around before the conversation starts, and he's looking at these sculptures, and he's thinking in his mind. He knows the audience. He's clearly read some of these pagan poems that he's referencing, and that there's just a sense that, obviously at some point you got to get to the conversation and you got to get to the truth. But before he does that, he takes his time to really understand the people that he's talking to at a deeper level than just where they're wrong, where he needs to correct their religious beliefs, but with their art, with their storytelling, with their poetry, with the things that really matter to them, and then engaging them on that level, kind of with some of that common ground, and allowing them to to emphasize the, as a positive, that you believe this, but you've touched on the truth. You've touched on a really good thing, and I commend you for that. Here's where there's more to the story than even you've recognized. But I think for Paul, it all starts with that initial step of really understanding, who am I talking to, and what really matters to them at a deep level.
Yeah, I love how he is walking around the city, and as a Pharisee, he knows full well how seriously God takes idolatry. And if he was disturbed in his spirit, he's walking around, perhaps going, "This is not good," to see all the stuff going down. But he didn't flip out in the streets and just start judging everyone. He actually compliments them on their spiritual sensitivity and says, "Hey, you guys are really religious," and he compliments them on that. And so I love how he starts out with a very invitational kind of approach. And then going to their concerns, if they're concerned about this unknown God, yeah, they're probably open to hearing about a God they don't know about, right? Because if they made a whole statue for this God they don't know about, so then he is able to start with their concerns and even adapt some of the Greek poems that are really about Zeus, that are kind of like the pop songs of the day, if you will. So I love how he does that. Well, there are 5 of these dialects you guys talk about. You call them dialects of the heart language in the book: story, beauty, art, desire, and community. And I want to take those and just kind of walk through some of them to give people a flavor of what you have in the book. So let's begin with story. Mike, help us to understand how we can use stories in a graceful and in an inviting way in our conversations about our faith.
Story, to me, is so fascinating because of how we're wired as people to embrace story. We can't help but viewing the world as in terms of story. We kind of frame our experiences, in this understanding of that we're writing our own autobiography, and we navigate through the world as if our story is unfolding right in front of us. And that's how we come to understand ourselves. That's how we come to understand the world around us. We have to put things in context of a story that makes sense. But everybody loves a good story, and so we lay out some ways of leveraging that. Like there's great stories in the Bible itself to share with people. Hey, let me tell you this. That reminds me of a story of Jesus. Have you ever heard the story of fill in the blank? Also, we've got lots of stories to tell. Testimony has always been kind of the go-to evangelism tool, right? But oftentimes we think, oh, do I just need to tell my testimony of when I first got saved, rather than updating that? Like, what has God done this past week? And we've got so many stories that we could tell.
Mm-hmm.
Are we telling those?
Yeah.
They may not be ready to dialogue about the intricacies of the philosophical, theological stuff. Maybe they are, but a good place to start is just engaging in stories with people.
Yeah, we don't have to think too hard to find roadblocks and mountains in our lives that we had to cross, get over, and hurdles. There's got to be that rising conflict, and we don't have to manufacture that stuff. That's just here in the world, right? So to think about not only our stories, but this overarching meta narrative of God's story and what He's doing and how we can be involved in what God's doing. I want to move to Daniel right now. Let's talk about beauty and art. Let's kind of handle those two things together. There's a part in the book that says a sermon activates the mind, but art activates the heart. And I love that. It was circled in my book, or I circled it. Is there a way for you to bring art into your teaching and preaching time, or the concept of beauty? How do you handle that?
At some level, art and stories and movies, and whether it's high art or just sort of more pop art, it does speak to us. And I think even you see the kind of speaking up from the church against the culture, like things like Netflix or Disney. That's where a lot of that attention is aimed now. It's not necessarily just the atheist professor at this college, or the intellectuals. So I think we intuitively know that the arts are really where culture change is happening. That's what takes these intellectual ideas and then like delivers them in a format that can get past our defenses, that can get past some of our rational mind, and go in at a heart level, often at like maybe a subconscious level. Are we allowing the arts to spread truth, to communicate in a way that does resonate with people? Because I think that's what the arts do. They communicate the same truth in many ways, but they do it in a way that can kind of slip in some of the cracks, some of the, I don't want to deal with this. If you're going to preach to me, as you're preaching, I'm going to be thinking in my mind all my objections to this, and I'm going to be very much engaged in that, kind of confrontation, more debate. Me, you, our ideologies are clashing. Where if a painting, even if you try and do that, and eventually you might get to that point where, okay, this is about Jesus, and now I'm going to be thinking why I don't agree with this painting, but when you see that painting, your heart's stirred. There's, whether you think that's beautiful, whether you're moved by it, and you might not understand those emotions, but you're feeling those emotions. And by the time you start thinking, kind of rationalizing what those emotions are, time has already passed from that initial, that initial moment where it did speak to your heart. If beauty points ultimately towards God, then we should be, fostering beauty wherever we are.
Yeah, yeah. When I was in Dallas, I was part of a couple of churches and working at Dallas Seminary as well, where we partnered with a group called Art House Dallas. And one of the churches I was at, we actually did art installations in the church. Not all the art has to be on the stage, during the worship time or during the sermon time, but to really highlight the arts at different times in the church. We've had people come in and just do like singer-songwriter type workshops, and people come in, local artists play music. And yeah, that kind of thing will get people to engage on a different level, a whole different level, than just hearing it presented in terms of propositional truth. Now, we need both. We need the truth, and then we also need the beauty that comes alongside, so we can show that the truth is actually beautiful and good. So it's rational and it's good as well. And that brings us to desire. This is the fourth dialect in the language of the heart. And I want to spend some time on this desire for identity, for purpose, and for transcendence. I love those three because I really encounter those a lot when I'm dialoguing with people out on the street. But first, Mike, can you unpack the introduction where you say Christianity fulfills the desires of our restless hearts and that we can make them wish it were true? How can you do that? Explain what you're talking about there.
Yeah, well, I that comes from Blaise Pascal. He was such an intellectual, such a reason, logic, math kind of guy, and yet he really started to see the tug and the conflict between what people desired and how they sought to fulfill that. And he said, oftentimes we try to fulfill that through distraction. We're not satisfied. It's like it doesn't do it for us. Oftentimes, unsatisfied hearts lead to pretty emotional responses, and so you see that in debates about identity, or those sorts of things, these things that people feel so passionately about. Why do they feel so passionately about that, right? Like it starts to touch on a nerve that's very deep
Yeah.
in a person's heart. I think one of the most dangerous things probably for the church is often to be seen kind of apathetically. If they look at the church and think there's nothing about that has anything to say or to do with what I really care about, then they're just going to be apathetic towards it. It's just going to be like, well, why would I even bother? Why would I even care? I've got these deep desires that need to be fulfilled, and I will find fulfillment for them. So I'll seek fulfillment for them somewhere. If we can start to home in on what some of these desires are, we start to realize, like, wow, Jesus does fulfill these. Like the gospel speaks directly into these things, but do people know that? Like the gospel actually speaks into the very deep desires that are driving us, the things that we love. And so I think bringing some of that to the forefront, like, hey, I see that identity is something you're very passionate about. Let me talk to you about like what Jesus does for someone's identity, what his teachings teach us about who we are, and how we find fulfillment for that, and bring our restless hearts to rest. And people are driven deep down by some very fundamental desires, and we don't want to squash those, or dismiss those. We actually want to take those seriously, because the gospel speaks directly into those things, and that's good. But I think a lot of people don't realize that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love Pascal as well. People just want to think about him just in terms of the wager and his math and all that. But he had a very spiritual experience that he called joy, 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 tears of joy. And before any emojis were around, he just called it fire. And he wrote it up, sewed it into his jacket, or he kept it with him all the time. And he's like, I want the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not just the God of the philosophers. So I think he's pushing people toward experiencing God as well, not just taking a bet. Sometimes he's just kind of caricatured as only talking about this wager, but really I think he's pushing people towards going to church and experiencing God as part of their. Don't just tack on more theistic proofs if it's not doing it for you. Why don't you go experience God? I think is where he's kind of driving people toward.
I've got a little Pascal action figure on my shelf somewhere. I can't see exactly. I'm attached to my headphones, but oh, here.
There you go. Wow. Well, there's Pascal's debut on the Apologetics Guy show right there.
Yeah.
Well, Daniel, talk about this in terms of the identity piece. Mike already mentioned sexuality. Let's go there. This is a place that a lot of Christians are kind of nervous to go for fear of being misunderstood, and maybe they just don't know how to navigate that area. How would you bring the identity piece into a discussion about sexuality, one of the top hot button issues we need to be prepared for today?
The conflicts, the tensions inside of the culture today are built on the foundation of just the question of who am I? How do I understand who I am right now? Who am I supposed to be? And how do I make sense of myself within sort of this larger story? And I think it's like you said, it's a incredibly valid until those questions are answered in a satisfying way, which we believe is only in the person of Jesus. Then they're going to continue to nag at you. They're going to continue to be a pressing question of who am I, and the identity that I think I've fashioned for myself isn't satisfying. No matter how many people affirm it or reject it, however comfortable I get with that, it's just not satisfying. So I think the first step is just allow those conversations to happen. Don't be dismissive of those questions, or don't get lost in the details of the different identities themselves. Allow identity to be, a valid pursuit to have, and then in love, walk alongside them, help them realize that what they're seeking has always been available. They just didn't realize it. And once they know that, then you can guide them towards that direction.
Mike, I'll let you weigh in on that. How would you approach that sexuality discussion of identity?
We often have too small a view of identity, and so like the debate goes around like our sexual identity or our gender identity, and we elevate them to a place where they're not fully satisfying for us. Like they don't fully answer all those questions. And so even if somebody gives in to all of that and says, I'm gonna fashion my own identity, start realizing that God created you unique. God knows you, and that God has a plan for your life, and that God loves you, and that Paul talks things about, there's no Jew or Greek, there's no slave or free. Like our identity starts to become deeper than something like gender or something like sexuality. He says, those who have put on Christ. I see it almost like a label that wraps around every other label that we've put on ourselves or others have put on us. He says, slave or free, female, male, like it's like all these things that are relevant today. He's like social class and, gender and race are the things that he mentions. Like those are huge today, just like they were back then. He says, but for though we are all one in Christ, those who have put on Christ. And there's this fascinating kind of mind picture I get of a label, of saying like we've got all these labels we put on ourselves, but Christ actually becomes this identity that unifies people instead of dividing people, and there's something deeper there than usually what we come up with on our own. When we're trying to figure out what's my identity, we sort of keep it at like a surface, a skin level, or that sort of thing. And what the gospel does is it just drills down deeper. Like actually your identity is more, it's not less, it's more than what you think it is. And Christ actually like helps you to understand yourself at a much deeper level than sort of the things that we usually fight and argue about. And of course it's a tricky conversation to have, because when we're talking about these desires, these are the landmines. Like these are the things that people will get the most defensive about, because we get the most defensive about the things that matter the most to us. And so when you start getting around some of those things, it can be a little perilous. But man, when people understand that Christ fulfills those things that they're passionate about, like now you're talking about speaking to the heart. Like now you're talking about somebody saying, whoa, like that is something I could give my life to, like that speaks to the things that are at the foundation of who I am and what I want out of life, and what I desire. So if we can navigate the terrain well, then I think it can be a very powerful thing to talk about with people, that Christ fulfills these desires, whether it's identity or any number of other ones.
Yeah, this identity piece is so important, and to elevate this idea of our identity not just being something we make up or something internal to us or something that changes, but actually having our identity in God, being made in the image of God, and as a Christian, having my identity in Christ, that's something that no one can take away from you, right? People who will say, "Oh, sexuality is fluid," and clearly your desires change, right? I mean, what happens when your desires change? If your identity is rooted in that, is your identity changing all the time? Or if your identity is in your socioeconomic status, well, what if you lose your job? Is your identity tied to that business card? You know. Well, the last part of your dialects community has a nice little section on justice. And here's another one that's another very commonly heard topic, this idea of justice. And I think it's important that we can speak to the concerns of our cultures that we minister in about justice. And one of those things is the problem of evil and suffering tends to come up. I'll give a chance to both you guys. How would you take both the intellectual side of that and then the emotional side of that and speak to a culture now that has in some ways privileged that emotional aspect of the problem of evil over the intellectual side? Let me go to Daniel first, then Mike.
Even the framework that you just gave, I think, is key. Understanding that it's not just an intellectual problem. When we're in a season like that, dealing with the problem of evil, both our heart and our head are going to be being tossed around in the storm, or the people that we're talking with. I'm actually reading right now the book Silence. The book became a Martin Scorsese film, and the whole book is just about that. It's about some priests that are in Japan, and growing when there's a lot of persecution, and just dealing with that question of why is there suffering? Why am I suffering? I know God is good, and yet my eyes are seeing pain all around me, and there's things about my circumstances that I can't line up with what I know to be true, and some emotions that I'm feeling that I almost feel guilty that I'm feeling because I'm questioning God in this circumstance. So I might leave Mike the intellectual side, but I think the emotional one is just understand that it's a hard problem. In some ways, it's easier for us to wrestle with the question at an intellectual level because the emotional part is hard. It's easier to dialogue than it is to just weep with someone and be okay with those emotions. And not that you don't ever get to the other side of it, but just being willing to rest in that a bit, being willing to lament, being willing to just come alongside someone that's struggling, and before you even start trying to guide them out of that season, just being a presence in their life, putting your arm around them, and acknowledging that this is a painful world. You're not wrong to have these questions. You're not wrong to even question where God is in this, because you're reacting to something that's very real. As Christians, just start there. Start being willing to just to love people, to weep with them, to lament with them, and just to be a presence alongside them before we want to jump in to start trying to explain away these emotions that they're very much feeling.
Yeah, I kind of think of I'm fascinated by C.S. Lewis, who wrote two books on the problem of evil. One, The Problem of Pain, very much intellectual, rational. And then his wife dies, and he writes another book from within pain. One is kind of on the outside looking in. The other one is written from the inside looking around, a grief observed. It's important to have both, right? It's like the head and the heart. And when you're sort of thinking more clearly outside of living the experience, then you can have some thoughts, like it's like, well, why does God allow this? The interesting question is just so what would you do differently if you were God? They say, well, why doesn't he just intervene whenever something bad's going to happen? It's like, well, do you know how cause and effect works? Like, there's countless things that happen that bring about every cause. It's not just one thing leads to this effect. It's like, and so at what point in that chain should God intervene? What should he do differently? Maybe the atheist that is challenging, like, well, he's God. Surely there's another way he could do this. And it's like, well, that's an easy response, right? It's like, let's brainstorm some ideas. Where would you start and kind of go from there? And what you find is that there's not a simple explanation of like, oh, well, God could have just done this instead. It's like, well, to do this would have led to this, and you can start going down that road. But I like what Daniel said too on things like helping people to find the beauty amidst all the ugly around them. What our hearts need is not an explanation, but just like an uplift, right? Like to find something beautiful. And you remember that scene in Patch Adams when he's, his girlfriend dies and he's real upset, and he's standing on the edge of a cliff, and he's basically challenging God, like, why did you let this happen? And he's just like, I could jump off this cliff. He's like, I could do it. I know you wouldn't stop me, sort of like challenging God. And then this butterfly flies up to him and like lands on his shoulder. And I think there's some sort of pseudo, like, the butterfly is meant to maybe be like reincarnation of his girlfriend, or like, I think you could go that way with it. But there's also just this sense of, but there's still beauty in the world, and even though there's lots of ugly and pain, there's also beauty, and that beauty is worth sticking around for. That's worth moving forward for. And it's hard to know how it all balances out, and we may not have an explanation for why the ugly is there in the first place. I think there are some explanations for that, but also helping people to focus on the power of beauty to actually get you through the ugly. There's also the idea of story, helping people to understand story. Hey, you're in the midst of a really hard chapter right now, but your life didn't start here, and it's not going to end here. Like, this is part of a bigger story, and every good story goes through these conflicts. How do you understand your story? And that's part of what happens with Job, right? Like, God never really gives Job a full explanation for why, as far as we know, Job never understands why everything was happening. Like, nobody ever tells him there was this showdown with the devil in the heavenly courts, and like as far as we know, nobody ever tells him that. But what God does is he reveals himself to Job, and Job says, I had heard of you with my ears, but now my eyes have seen you. Like, all of a sudden, the questions Job was asking are put in this different context. Like, wow, like, I've just come in contact with something that is so transcendently bigger that it doesn't make my questions unimportant, but it does kind of put them in context of sense of scale. Like, and and they see this even in psychology, right? This idea of post-traumatic growth. If you can understand your pain in the context of a story, if you can make sense of your pain in the context of your life story, then it actually helps you psychologically. It like gives you this uplift to have physical health benefits they found up to a year later than those who could not understand how the pain fits into their life story. Is like, this doesn't make sense at all. And so I think what the gospel can do, it can make sense of some of that stuff, and ultimately it drives you to a relationship where we say, look, God doesn't just have sympathy for you, he has empathy for you. He experienced the worst that this world has to offer and was triumphant over it. And that same Jesus can be your identity, can be your life. And maybe those of us who've grown up hearing that a lot, we can kind of become jaded to that a bit. But I think for people who've never heard that, like, that's so different than anything that the world offers, that I think that intrigues people to just say, what if this stuff is true? Because that totally changes my perspective on what I'm going through. So there's lots more, obviously, in that, in that big question, but I think there's some starting points of how those conversations could go.
I like how you both started out referring to movies and then moved into the scriptures and the stories that we see in Job, and then, of course, even in the Atonement. Meditating on the cross of Christ, but taking these stories, taking these emotions, and really orienting our answers around people's stories and around how they're reacting to these things emotionally, not only on the intellectual side. So we need to both engage the head and the heart. So thank you guys so much for being on the show today. Mike, is there anything else you want to say before we land the plane on this episode?
I would just say thanks for having us. We appreciate being able to have these conversations, and we love apologetics. And so thank you for what you do. We love what you're doing on this podcast, and hope that it will just continue to gain traction. We think you're doing a great ministry, so keep it up.
Thanks so much. Daniel, thanks for being on the show too.
This was fun. Appreciate you having us both on.
And we thank you for joining us here on the Apologetics Guy Show. If you like this episode, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, rate us on Spotify. It really does help more people find out what we're doing here, and it gives more of a chance for people to hear the show. And if you're watching on the YouTube side, please leave us a comment. We'd love to engage with you in the comments here on YouTube. As always, I'm your Apologetics Guy, Dr. McKell, and until next time, keep the faith.